is the E-Rotary Coastal Club. It's Thursday, July the 20th, 2017. So glad you're able to join with us today. We are a club that's established to bring our coastal communities together on those issues which most vitally impact the residents and the businesses in our coastal communities. And there's a lot of things happening on the coast, and we want to present you the experts in their particular fields of endeavor who are dealing in the area of the coastal issues. And so that's why we're here and why we're doing what we're doing today. We're a Rotary club, and Rotary has several traditions that they do at the beginning of a club meeting, and we'll go ahead and get started with that. First one is to say the Pledge of Allegiance. So whether you're seated or standing, I guess if you want to stand for the flag, we go ahead and recite the Pledge of Allegiance. I'll do that now. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The second tenet that's practiced in a Rotary Club is the four-way test, and these are the things we think, say, or do. Is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? Will it be beneficial to all concerned? These tenets of Rotary are very dear to Rotarians and non-Rotarians alike in the way that we conduct ourselves, both in our, as it says, what we think, say, or do. And in that regard, it is our desire to serve. Rotarians is a service-based organization, and Rotarians themselves are servant leaders in their communities. And whenever we serve, we want to do that in a way that's beneficial, not just for the people that we're serving, but for their communities, and to make sure that in that process, it does build goodwill and better friendships. Rotary International is a global organization with 1.2 million members, and so we're part of a great organization and a great fellowship to belong to. And I will go ahead and get started with our speaker today. This is Tanner Johnson. He's the director of the Gulf Environmental Benefit Fund for the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. Give you a little bit of Tanner's background. He was born in Baton Rouge, and he worked for more than a decade on coastal conservation and restoration policy at the federal, state, and local levels. After earning his law degree from the LSU Law School, Tanner developed a focus on Louisiana's imperiled coast in public service as a legislative director to U.S. Senator Mary Landrieu and an aide to Governor Kathleen Blanco. And his work in these positions contributed to the development and unanimous adoption of Louisiana's 2007 Coastal Master Plan, entitled the Integrated Ecosystem Restoration and Hurricane Protection. In the wake of 2010 Deepwater Horizon, Tanner helped author and lead the congressional staff level negotiation of the resources and ecosystem sustainability, tourist opportunities, and revived economies of the Gulf Coast States Act. It's a long act, but it's called the Restore Act. That's a good acronym, which dedicates 80% of civil and administrative Clean Water Act penalties paid by those responsible for the 2010 Gulf oil disaster to Gulf restoration. And with that, Tanner, I'm going to turn it over to you to let us know what you're doing on the coast.
Okay, thanks. I guess this is the equivalent of walking to the podium. You got to go through the steps here on the computer screen, and as that comes up, I just want to thank you guys for allowing me to speak to the group, to the club. I'm a lapsed Rotarian. For a brief time, I was able to be a part of the main Rotary Club that meets at here in Baton Rouge, and I enjoyed it immensely. But my travel schedule in this position and other things made me too infrequent of a participant, so I stepped away. But I'm pleased to be back in the fold as a presenter today. I've done this a lot of times in front of folks, but this is my first time doing it virtually. So the greatest likelihood is that I would get carried away talking and not know if my voice wasn't carrying, or you weren't hearing me or I was talking too fast. So just stop me, Charles or Philip, if that happens. But I'm going to jump right in and talk a little bit about the organization I work for first. That's called the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. And then I'll talk a little bit about the work that we're doing here in coastal Louisiana and throughout the Gulf Coast. The National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, and its approved acronym, which our marketing folks say it's okay to say NIFWIF, even though it sounds like a penalty in a badminton match. It's an accepted acronym, and that's how I'll refer to it today during the talk. NIFWIF, as the slide says, was created by Congress. Congress, from time to time, and a lot of folks may not know this, has found in its wisdom to create either quasi-governmental organizations or even fully nonprofit organizations. And when they do, they typically operate just like any other 501c3. The National Fish and Wildlife Foundation was created in 1984 as one of those such congressionally chartered nonprofits. There's lots of stories as to why it came about. It's not really relevant for today's presentation, but I think that it's important to mention that its core mission of funding conservation and restoration work nationally was an appealing political. It was politically appealing. I think remains still today for both progressives and conservatives along the political spectrum that serve and represent us in Congress. That's changed throughout time, but ever since our creation, we have enjoyed successful fundraising and implementation as a grant maker. The Congress maintains a role of oversight over NIFWIF. Each year we present reports both to the public and the Congress. Our board is appointed for staggered 6-year terms by the U.S. Secretary of Interior, and they represent a broad spectrum of citizens from across the country. We also have ex officio representation from the Department of Interior and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA. What makes us additionally unique as an organization is the natural resource agencies of the United States government, which are funded by Congress to carry out various natural resource conservation, restoration, protection. They are uniquely authorized to partner with us. By law, those agencies, which now number almost a dozen, can enter into cooperative endeavor agreements with NIFWIF, wherein our private fundraising, capital raised by corporations and individuals, can be married together with those public tax dollars. And our leadership is very proud to brag, and has for a number of years, to the Congress and the public, that we've leveraged the federal taxpayer dollar that is intended for conservation work on the tune of an average of 3 to 1. So that's really who we are, but it leaves out a major part, and a major part of why I'm having the opportunity to do the work I am here in Louisiana throughout the Gulf Coast. This slide talks about our core responsibility as a convener and a focuser of funding, leveraging federal and non-federal dollars for our work in making grant making for conservation. But as I indicated, there's this other part of our work, and internally we refer to it as impact-directed environmental accounts. This was created at some time after the beginning of NIFWIF, and it serves as an opportunity for us to leverage our expertise as a grant maker around conservation when there is some sort of enforcement, settlement, judgment by a court, or other action where an environmental harm is seeking to be rectified. Those come in a lot of different forms. The most traditional and the most common for us are what's referred to as community service payments. And typically, if a person, legal person, an actor or a company, an individual or a company violates a federal criminal environmental statute, they would be forced or in settlement or by judgment to make a community service payment. And those have to be intended to restore the harm made to the environment. And NFWF is one of a couple organizations that the prosecuting or enforcing agency could ask to carry out those restitution payments or community service payments. And we've done that in a number of cases. I think the number of accounts like that number in the hundreds over the lifetime of our program. And the largest of those came as a result of the BP oil spill. Of course, everyone knows that in April 2010, we lost 11 men in the Gulf of Mexico, one of whom was a childhood friend of mine. The family, the Keith Jones family, lost a brother, a husband, and Gordon was somebody that I knew pretty well. So that was the first shock that I had personally, was knowing someone who lost their life in this horrific way. But as we all witnessed, it was just an unmitigated environmental disaster following that first crisis. I at the time was working for our senior United States Senator Mary Landrieu, who was very well known and passionate about coastal issues, and it became the center point of our work for the rest of her term in Congress. The oil spill created opportunities, and as you can see from this slide, BP and the other companies that were involved ultimately made settlement for the environmental claims that they faced, and I'm excluding the economic restitutions that they made to the 5 Gulf Coast states, to the tune of $16.7 billion. And those funds, and that's now settled by the court and certified by the federal judge in New Orleans. And these 3 columns on the slide I've presented represent the 3 main avenues through which that funding will flow. On the far left, the number $8.8 billion represents the natural resource damage assessment process. That is existing federal law that existed prior to the oil spill, and it's the process by which a responsible party who has injured the environment is made to bring the environment back to the state it existed prior to the injury. And it's a very complex and systematic process by which the responsible party actively engages the natural resource trustee agencies, those at the state and federal level, to determine the injury, to negotiate the monetary value of that injury, and the approach for restoring it. So in the process of its settlement, BP and the other companies agreed to pay, as you see, over $8 billion. After the oil spill, and during my work as a staff person in Congress, the Congress adopted the Restore Act, as Philip referred to in my introduction. The impetus for this piece of legislation came about when members from the Louisiana delegation of congressmen and senators and other states as well realized that there could potentially be criminal and civil penalties above and beyond the Natural Resource Damage Assessment and the Oil Spill Pollution Act. And so they adopted, at great difficulty, I might say, over the objection of many members of Congress from other parts of the country, they adopted the Restore Act, and it was signed into law in 2012. And that takes 80% of the penalties that are above and beyond the natural resource damage process and directs it through a myriad of different revenue streams back to the 5 Gulf Coast states. If that act had not been passed, those monies would have gone to the General Treasury of the United States, and in my personal opinion, to be squandered on things unrelated to the oil spill. In addition to all of this, and actually preceding the passage of the Restore Act, BP and Transocean signed on to criminal plea agreements, admitting their criminal liability and agreeing to make payments to a variety of sources with the criminal penalties they would pay, one of them being to the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. And I'm going to talk about that. We refer to it as the Gulf Environmental Benefit Fund. The amount of funds is $2.5 billion in round numbers, and that's going to be the focus of my presentation. Mainly, it's given a great opportunity to Louisiana to fund some of the major restoration and protection projects that it's been envisioning for a number of years. But this slide represents the landscape in as brief a format as you can after the oil spill. And we're going to focus on the amount that is being administered by the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. So let's dive into that. The Gulf Environmental Benefit Fund was created in 2013 after BP and Transocean reached resolution on their criminal responsibilities. The terms of their plea agreement, which is represented in a couple paragraphs of their plea agreement, really gave us our marching orders. And they are, at their crux, we must spend these funds on remedying harm and reducing the future risk of harm to the type of natural resources, habitats, and species that were affected by the oil spill. It probably made our lives a little more difficult at the beginning of the program because the natural resource damage process, which is the established systematic process by which the responsible party, BP and Transocean mainly, they negotiate with those resource agencies to determine what was injured, down through the ranks of plant and animal wildlife and all the habitat. They negotiated out a very specific arrangement. Those things were not known to us, and so we took and I'll show in the presentation, a very broad, very intuitive, common sense approach to the known habitats and species that were impacted by the spill, and it served us well as a framework for conservation restoration in the Gulf. We're required to consult with the Fish and Wildlife Service and NOAA, and with the state agencies responsible in the 5 states. They're typically your natural resource departments and other entities that are responsible for conservation and restoration. Thankfully, the criminal plea agreements told us how much money, at the end of the day, each state was going to get. We didn't have to deal with sorting that fight out. And as you see on the slide, Louisiana will ultimately be the recipient of half of the funds, $1.27 billion. The states of Alabama, Florida, and Mississippi will each ultimately be the recipient of $356 million in projects in their state, and Texas brings up the rear with just over $200 million. The last element of the criminal plea agreements that's very important is in Louisiana, the only 2 project types for this source of funding are barrier islands and river diversion projects on the Mississippi or Atchafalaya River. That's unique to Louisiana alone. In the other states, there are a multitude of project types, and we really, as I'll talk about in a minute, we look to the state resource agencies to identify the best use of those funds. But in Louisiana, there are only 2 project types, and we coordinate with the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority, the CPRA of Louisiana, and we must consider the state's master plan, which, as some of you may know, they just updated as they're required to do by law, and the legislature unanimously approved their update. BP and Transocean were committed to make payments totaling $2.54 billion over this schedule that shows up on the screen. Those payments were started in April 2013. Under the column labeled payments is the total payment, and that's a sum total of the individual payments made for the states. As you can see, the last 2 payments, the one we just received this year and the one that will come to us in 2018, represent over half the fund. So if you showed it on a chart, it'd be sort of a reverse hockey stick. And I think that's been beneficial to both our management of these funds as well as for the states as they ramp up, finish up plans, develop engineering design specifications for various projects, so that they sort of ramp up into implementation of large-scale projects. To date, as you see, $1.65 billion has been received by NIFWIF, and we hold those funds and respond to grant proposals from the states. These are the agencies we consult with throughout the Gulf Coast. My work is primarily focused on Louisiana and Texas, but through my position, we have a programmatic team that deals with all 5 states and the 2 federal agencies. Some of the states have some comprehensive planning efforts, like Louisiana has with its comprehensive plan. Some of them don't, and they've worked to develop those. At this stage of our program, nearly all of them have developed some sort of mechanism for receiving ideas from the general public. It bears mentioning that while the Natural Resource Damage Assessment and the Restore Act, the other 2 buckets of money that followed the oil spill, have pretty specific public engagement requirements, ours did not. The criminal plea agreements for BP and Transocean did not require public engagement. They required the interaction consultation with these state and federal agencies. And so our board of directors took it upon themselves to ensure that these agencies were going through some sort of public vetting. And many of them have combined it with the public vetting and input that they've gathered around the natural resource damages and the Restore Act. So they've, in the instance of, for instance, Texas has a portal for any restoration activity, and the state agencies in Texas receive project ideas from the public, and then they determine which funding source, NERDA, Restore, or NIFWIF, the project best aligns with. And then they start their vetting process from there. What comes to us is a project idea. This slide's a little cumbersome, but what it represents is our reliance upon the state agencies. In the center box on the left, represented with the word state agencies, as the coordinator of project ideas that are then submitted to NIFWIF as a grant proposal each year in February, March. We work internally and with the federal agencies to vet that list. We consult back with the states, and then those project proposals are presented to a committee of our board for review and approval by our board. Our board makes, as required by the criminal plea agreements, the final decision on funding, but we rely heavily upon this consensus-driven, that's represented by the circular arrow, process with the states to determine the best use of the funds. Revisiting briefly that schedule that BP and Transocean were on, Transocean has paid its amount already. BP still has one remaining payment. This is fixed in the criminal plea agreements as the time frame within which those parties must make payments to NIFWIF, but we're not under any constraint, artificial or any otherwise, to get funding out the door. We want to do it as quickly and as efficiently as possible, but that's been beneficial so that NIFWIF can work with the states to determine the best timing for implementation and the drawdown of the funds. Some of these funds may continue out beyond this schedule you see on the screen. So as I touched on before, there are some required criteria for this funding source, and there are some others that we've had the discretion to put in place. These funds must only be used for environmental projects. They can't be used for general infrastructure, roads and bridges and things of that nature, not for levees or flood control projects, because they have to be focused on remedying harm to the type of resources that were impacted by the spill. They have to be within the state boundaries of the 5 Gulf Coast states that were impacted. And in Louisiana, as I said before, they can only be spent on barrier islands and river diversions. We've attempted to build in additional criteria to make sure that these funds are being used as prudently as possible. And you see there that we do coordinate with the other 2 funding sources, Restore and NERDA. We work to ensure with our internal staff here and through the consultation that the projects proposed have measurable outcomes and they're based in the best available science. And then we're required for these projects to maximize environmental benefit, and that's a an element of cost-benefit ratio that we've applied to these projects to make sure that one particular project chosen over the other results in the biggest bang for the buck. So those criteria and the known injuries to the Gulf helped develop this list of overarching goals and focal areas for our work. And as you can see, barrier islands are prominent as the first line of natural resource characteristics that were impacted by the spill, but also those interior marsh, bays, and estuaries, and then the living resources that depend upon that habitat. They all were impacted in some way to greater or lesser degree by the oil spill, and they help frame our overarching goals. So when a project is received as a proposal to us, these goals and focal areas help us sort of make sure that they fit within the framework. To date, over 100 projects have been selected in the 5 Gulf Coast states. We've obligated over $800 million. We have on our website, and if there's interest, I don't technically mess up the presentation, could click over and show you a map on our website, www.nifwif.org/Gulf, where we have a physical map of these projects, where they've been implemented in the Gulf of Mexico, and a clickable, detailed description of each of the projects. But the impact has been of $800 million plus has been amazing. Over 80,000 acres of wetlands and coastal habitats, 7+ miles of barrier islands. Most of that is a project that we featured recently with the governor of Louisiana at the Caminada Headland, just near Port Fourchon. This project, as a barrier island headland project for Louisiana, has been a focal point of the master plan for a great number of years. Its degradation as a front line in that part of the coast has been persistent and a huge problem for the communities that support and the port of Port Fourchon in and around that area. So it's been a priority for the state. They implemented a first increment of that Caminada Headland Restoration Project using a mix of state and federal funds. And it was the 7 miles from Belle Pass, right near Port Fourchon, going to the middle of the headland. And the second increment, going the rest of the 7 miles all the way to the pass between Grand Isle, which most folks refer to as Elmer's Island, was implemented with this funding source, the Gulf Environmental Benefit Fund. The project was completed in the fall of last year, and it brought 5 million cubic yards of sand from the Ship Shoal, 20 miles offshore, to restore that barrier island. And it's an amazing accomplishment for the state of Louisiana. We just played a part in helping steward the funds through this program to the state. The issue of shoreline restoration, both barrier islands, beach dune restoration, but also eroding shorelines, has been something consistent through all the states. In most recently in Texas, we have received a proposal for a 18-mile stretch of beach from the state line of Louisiana all the way to High Island, Texas. So that upper part of the coast of Texas is an area that's had shoreline erosion, coastal inundation from storms and other events that have breached through that beach and begun to degrade the wetlands of the McFadden National Wildlife Refuge and a state wildlife management area. One of the real jewels of the upper coast of Texas is really compromised because of the degradation of that coastline. So that number, 12 miles of shoreline in Texas and Alabama, will grow. We hope if that project is approved and goes to construction, it would start construction next spring, and it would deliver several million cubic yards of sand. And both of those projects, the question we get a lot of questions about is how sustainable are these projects. And they are specifically designed to a design life of 30 plus years, taking into account the most dire sea level rise and the increased severity and frequency of storms in the Gulf of Mexico. And that was something that was a great focus of our board as a funder. We're not engineers, we're not policymakers at the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, but through our role as a funder, we've sought to scrutinize these plans and projects to make sure, as I said before, that we're maximizing the environmental benefit with the dollars that we have available. So we feel pretty confident about that in a great number of these projects. So moving forward, as I indicated before, we have been at this since 2013, and we work on a general timeline that is framed by when we receive the payments from BP. That occurs in January, February. So since 2013, we've accepted proposals from the state resource agencies in and around the time frame of March each calendar year. We go through our process from March to September of vetting these proposals. Typically involves, as I was mentioning to Philip as we started the call, we have technical scientific staff that go down and visit each project proposal. We lay eyes and hands on every proposal. If it's only a planning or an engineering stage, we meet with the engineers. We visit the site, propose for the work. We work with the consultative agencies, the federal agencies, to determine whether and what permits are needed and if they've been obtained or what the process is. Any concerns with other projects nearby and other issues are addressed in this stage. We scrub the project for its scope, for the schedule and the budget to make sure that they're realistic and that the project can be implemented on time. And in nearly every case, the states have brought to us projects that go pretty easily through that process. But we've also had instances where we really need to revisit the project itself before going forward to the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation Board. But we typically seek to have those projects scrubbed thoroughly, and they're presented to our board at its quarterly meeting in November, and it makes a decision at that time whether to fund the project or not. And as I indicated before, we've now funded over 100 projects since 2013, all of varying size and scale, from the smallest, several $100,000 design projects to really come up with the right approach and the right chosen alternative to a particular conservation or restoration project, all the way up to the implementation of those projects. In the case of Caminada Barrier Island in Louisiana, that was a $150 million construction project. So there have been really very wide variety of projects, both in type and size and scale. After approving the projects, our board then directs us to enter into funding agreements. I guess some folks have called them grants, but they are a contractual arrangement with the state to actively manage the disbursement of funds through that contract for the implementation of the project. I think all in all, we've dispersed somewhere in the order of 50 to 60% of that $800 million that has been obligated or put under contract by our board. And that's something our board has wanted to actively maintain a good handle on, because it gives you the truest picture of what dollars have actually reached the ground. I'd be happy to go into anything else. I think I went through my slides more quickly than I thought I would, but also talk with you guys more informally and answer any questions you have.
Would you mind going to the map that you referred to on your website?
Yeah, sure. Let's make sure I can do that. going to test my computer's capabilities here. Trying to find the best way to navigate that. Well, somebody must have taken down the map. This is a great opportunity, though, to navigate what I think is a very good and comprehensive list of the projects that we have on the ground. We'll take a look at the projects in Louisiana. So the real thrust of Louisiana's work for barrier islands and river diversions has resulted in a couple major projects. As I indicated, we funded the construction of the Caminada Barrier Island project, which is just adjacent to Port Fourchon. And it's a now complete project. But the two other issues, the other issue in Louisiana, the engineering and design for the large-scale sediment diversions, has really been the focus of our work recently. And as a lot of people know, the state has planned for decades to implement sediment diversions on the Mississippi River, but it has not gotten any of those into implementation as of yet. This funding source represented an opportunity for the state to choose to do that. And in the previous administration, the general administration, and in this administration, the state committed itself to using a portion of these funds through the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation for both the engineering and design and ultimately the construction of one or more of the major sediment diversions on the Mississippi River. The two diversions that they have identified are referred to as the Mid-Barataria diversion, which would convey sediment-rich river from the Mississippi River west into the Barataria Basin. And the other is the Mid-Breton sediment diversion, just a few miles north of there, both south of New Orleans, that would convey sediment-rich river water into the Breton Sound area to the east of the river. Both of those projects are proposals that came to NIFWF for their engineering and design stage. The Mid-Barataria sediment diversion would ultimately be $1 billion construction project, and the engineering and design of it is $100 million, including the contingencies. And as you see here, the design of the project relies heavily upon a lot of the modeling that is ongoing and has been done by the state to determine the optimal place, method, and time of which the state would seek to divert those sediment-rich waters into the basin from the Mississippi River. And of course, the state is responsible for getting the permits from the Corps of Engineers and the other federal agencies, and working through the public issues relating to impact to fisheries and oysters and the community concerns with flooding and otherwise about these diversions. All of those matters are the responsibility of the state. Our responsibility as the funder is to make sure that the needed funds are budgeted properly and utilized as according to that budget. So as you see on this project sheet here, description from our website, at the end of 2016, last year, the NIFWF board approved a $102 million award to complete the engineering, design, and permitting of the Mid-Barataria sediment diversion, which is anticipated to start construction in 2021. That date is uncertain because there's so many elements of the design and environmental compliance process that are unknown. Interested concerned parties could sue over the project under the laws that come through NEPA, the Federal National Environmental Policy Act. So the precise schedule is unknown, which makes it an additionally complex effort to fund as a funder. But we have implemented, we have put under contract in stages this $100 million, and NIFWF is actively working as a member of the project team with the CPRA to implement this project. The Mid-Breton project is a little further, not as far along in its development, but it's a similar effort of magnitude, and it would result in the construction of what's estimated to be about a $500 million construction project. So both of these projects really form the centerpiece of work remaining with the available funds through NIFWF for CPRA in Louisiana. And while they've been conceived of and planned for many years, this is really the first opportunity with true funding that the state of Louisiana has had. So in large measure, these projects are just now getting underway. And I could go through some other examples of projects if y'all like, or answer any questions specifically about Louisiana.
Tina, this is Philip. I do have a follow-up. One, before we started the meeting, we were having a conversation. I was talking about having the variety of people that we've had speak to our club, and I have to say that this is another one of those examples of why the benefit of who we are. I had no idea of this idea of the fact that you were the funding agents or the funding source, the foundation. They got a big chunk of money from BP with the specific, as you said, it was written into the agreement, the settlement agreement, of actual disbursement of the funds, what they would be spent on in the different states. And it's just absolutely fascinating that this exists. I was just totally unaware of this. And I was very interested in what you were saying as far as getting together with the state and federal agencies, and I guess in the states and themselves, to find out what projects they would like to pursue, and then as you would scrub them, I guess to make sure that it's a valid project, it has sustainability. I'm sure there's a lot of things in that scrubbing process that you go through to make sure that this is a project you want to fund. In that regard, in regards to where the funds are actually going, has it been the foundation's experience that are the funds going to state resources on these, or is it going into the private sector for the engineering design? How has that worked, or do you give the money to another agencies and they disperse the money?
Gotcha.
What's your role in that?
Well, in Louisiana, and I'll start with that because it's the most unique of the other four states. In Louisiana, our primary and exclusive partner is the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority of Louisiana, the CPRA. And so prior to engaging us on any project idea, and we have others, there have been, the CPRA has an adaptive management program that has a number of individual contractors that work for the CPRA. These large-scale projects have individual contractors that work on the projects. We had the Caminada project. We have a coming project potentially for the East Timbaleer barrier island, which is just west of the Caminada barrier island and in dire need of restoration. In all those cases, CPRA does the state procurement through its laws that govern that, for hiring the design firms, for hiring the contractors that actually build the projects. And we are a step removed from that. So we make the grants to CPRA, and they then flow the cash to their contractors. That's in Louisiana. And in the other states, the first step of identifying and letting us know of the desired project comes from the state agency. But we have had a variety of mechanisms for implementing the project, which do include funding state agencies as we do with CPRA, but it also funding not-for-profit local political subdivisions like counties, funding them directly. And we utilize best practices developed for scrutinizing the recipient, ensuring they're above board and capable of carrying out a project, determining what contractors they may have or may not have to implement a project, who they are, what their background and record and expertise is, what their rates are, and whether they're reasonable or not. And so we've issued these funding agreements for funding to flow to nonprofits, counties. In very limited to no instances do they go directly to a private contractor. There's usually a sponsor that is some sort of governmental or nonprofit. And so it's run the gamut outside of Louisiana.
Okay, very good. Any other questions out there? Any other
Philip,
questions
I just wanted to make an observation about your question or being sort of surprised with the funding source. I think that's been typical of the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation throughout its life, is a foundation that has been in the background as a funder, a convener, and therein an implementer of some pretty amazing work throughout the country. I had the same shock, and I have it every day, that I don't have more folks concerned with projects or wanting particular projects or not wanting particular projects ringing my phone. It's been a very interesting aspect of that, and some of that has been a conscious choice by NFWF to really push the states out, as they are, as elected and appointed officials, the folks responsible with the Natural Resource Trust responsibility in their state, is to push them out to the forefront as the first point of interaction with their constituents, voters, and interested stakeholders. But it's an interesting observation you make, and I share the same.
In that environment, the fact that there was our federal government set up the NFWF, and then as a result of the BP spill, the dedication of funds to your organization for that as that funding mechanism for the impact. I'm just curious in that process, $2.5 billion. That's I guess in our federal government terms, that's not a lot of money, pocket change. But in our environment, it can be a lot of money. And the question I have in regards to, I guess it goes back to the 2017 master plan, as you're dedicating these funds toward the master plan, what is the NFWF's view on the projects that they're going to undertake? Is it the ones that are most critical? I guess that would be the question. So I assume that the projects that you have identified are the most critical in regards to the current master plan?
Yes, and that was a collaborative process of identifying that with the CPRA. Early on in the relationship in 2013, under the previous administration and still today in this administration, speaking of Governor Jindal and then now Governor Edwards, their staff, their teams, their leadership at CPRA have had the unenviable task, but very blessed, I think, opportunity to look at the master plan and identify this amazing opportunity of funding through NFWF, through the Restore Act and NRDA, and work to match their high priority projects in the master plan with those funding sources, prioritize them based upon those available funds, and then figure out how to cash flow it. In the case of NFWF, I showed you that table wherein BP and Transocean have made payments to us. Under the NRDA and Restore settlements, which were committed to after the criminal settlement, those civil settlements were made just a year and a half ago, or actually was announced 2 years ago this summer and then finally certified in the spring of last year. BP will make 15 payments over the course of 16 years. So the states have to take those projects, some very large scale like in Louisiana, but even in the other states, more moderately scaled projects, and they have to figure out the cash flow. And there are a number of obstacles to that. States are investigating ways of potentially issuing bonds. There's several pieces of legislation, both in Washington at the state level, to help remove some obstacles to that, so that they can also figure out not only what the projects are, which are the most important, but how to cash flow them because of the staggered inflow of this source of revenue.
That's very good. That's very good. I'm just let me just follow up my questions with just saying that, you know, I really appreciate it personally, that you're in this position that you are, and really being the director of this funding program. And I know it does carry a lot of responsibility, and especially since you're dealing with 5 different states, and while Louisiana gets half of it, the other half are going to the surrounding 4 states. And you have a lot of different people, I'm sure, that just you're dealing with on a pretty consistent basis. And thank you for being a good fiduciary of the funds that you've been given to address the needs of the states that were impacted by the spill. So.
Well, I appreciate that, and thank you again for letting me make this presentation to the group and for the recording for this club.
Anyone else before we conclude our presentation? All right. Well, no comments heard. Charles, I'll go ahead and let you conclude our meeting. And Tanner, let me just say before Charles gets on, thank you again for presenting. Awesome presentation. I learned a lot today, and have a lot more respect really for the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. I really didn't know what you did and where you came from. I've heard of it, but I'm a lot more educated now, and I'm very happy that you're here. So Charles, go ahead and sign this off. Thank you.
Well, great. Just to say thank you to everybody for attending. You know, again, the depth and the quality of this information is just astounding, and to see at a real tangible level everything that's going on. Other than that, please watch emails for our next meeting 2 weeks from now, and y'all have a great day. Enjoy the sunshine.
Thank you.
Thank you. Y'all have a great day. Bye.
Bye.